Morning. My name is Jennifer DeMudd, and I am the Executive Director of the Manufacturing Growth Alliance, also known as MGA. We are a membership-based organization that provides services to help manufacturers build smart, lead strong, and establish a pathway for future growth. MGA services drive solutions that make manufacturing in Michigan the most competitive and prosperous in the nation. During the past 6 months, manufacturers have asked about protecting their data in a new environment. With work from home flexibilities for the workforce, manufacturers desire to mitigate the risk to protect their organizations. Microvisions, Inc. will be our presenter today. They have been in business for over 30 years and have a deep understanding of IT infrastructure and mitigating risks. Before I introduce our presenters, I have a few housekeeping items I'd like to share. We encourage questions and comments, so please share those in the chat box. We'll monitor the chat box and make sure that those questions and comments get to the presenters. We will also be recording the conversation today, so this recording will be sent out to all those that registered for the webinar today, as well as other small manufacturers will have access to the recording via YouTube. Now let's introduce our presenters. Julie Locke is the president of Microvisions. Julie goes through great lengths to ensure her employees and clients are successful. She has extensive technical knowledge that has supported the growth of Microvisions for over 30 years. Also joining us is Ben Knighton. He is an account executive with Microvisions. Ben supports small to medium businesses with not just IT support. He focuses on truly understanding clients' goals and objectives, culture, and unique challenges so that Microvisions can help them optimize their systems to work for them. Let's welcome Julie and Ben. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Okay, so yeah, let's get started. Again, thanks, Jen, for having us. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us for the next hour or so, and hopefully this will be an educational hour for you, and you'll find some value out of it. So if anybody has questions throughout, please don't hesitate to throw those in the chat feature. Jen will be monitoring that. So Jen, feel free to chime in with those as appropriate. And then we've also saved some time at the end to answer questions as well. So go ahead with the next slide, Jen. Jen, go ahead with the next slide. Perfect. Okay. So the main focus of this presentation is really to talk about the new environment that exists due to the conditions that you are all very aware of, and that really every business has had to adapt to, which is the remote work environment. We'll also touch on some of the other factors that have come out of these new working conditions, and how they have affected businesses from an IT perspective, and specifically an IT security perspective. As I'm sure you've all figured out by now, having a handle on your IT security as a business has really never been more important than it is now, because breaches are happening far too often, to both large and small to mid-sized businesses. In fact, they predict that a breach will happen about every 11 seconds in 2021, which is crazy to think about. So, the goal for today and what we hope you take away from this is just a better understanding of how the remote work environment affects your IT security and some of the things you can do to improve on that, and decrease your security risk as a business. So go ahead, next slide, Jen. Perfect. Okay. So, as frustrating as IT can be, and potentially how daunting it can be for an organization, from anywhere to the C-level executives down to the end users, at the end of the day, IT is a tool, and it's a very valuable tool, especially for manufacturers. because of how important your data is to you. You know, data for manufacturers is gold because it gives you insight and information that helps you do your job better, right? You know, it tells you how much material to buy. It helps you with forecasting, with order fulfillment. It can help with decreasing scrap or rework or, you know, with quality control. You know, so all of these things are things manufacturers are thinking about on a daily basis. And IT affects every one of these. You know, your IT should be an asset, and it should help you improve, not hinder you, and give you the ability to focus on these things listed here and help you achieve your objectives. You know, IT and manufacturing has never been more connected than they are now, and especially with this new remote work environment in the mix, it's even more important to have an IT environment that helps you do your job better, you know, and that helps you keep your data secure, accessible, and recoverable. You'll hear that many times around our office. That's one of our mantras: keeping data secure, accessible, and recoverable. But you know, as much experience as we have had with our manufacturing partners and supporting them, at the end of the day, Microvisions is not a manufacturer. So if we missed anything on this list, we'd love to hear what else you guys as manufacturers, you know, are focusing on or concerned about on a day-to-day basis, and as it relates to IT. So feel free to write those in the chat. We'd love to hear those. So go ahead, next slide, Jen. Okay, so what do we mean by the new environment? And there are a few things here that play into this. So the first one is very apparent, and that is the increase in remote workers due to COVID. You know, and manufacturers are already unique in that before COVID, they already had multiple IT environments, right? So they had the factory floor environment, and then they had the office environment. So each one has its own IT security concerns and should be treated differently and set up differently. And now the increase in remote workers has created a sort of a third environment for manufacturers. And that is, you know, workers outside of the office, whether they're at home, at a coffee shop, you know, wherever you set up shop to work. And then the next factor that plays into the new environment is the rise in cybercrime. Lost my spot. So prior to COVID, you know, cybercrime was on the rise, and it was actually happening more than it has ever had. And that trend continued with COVID and actually started to rise faster due to the added vulnerabilities that exist or that were created with the remote work environment. You know, cyber criminals have taken full advantage of this situation because this forced change from COVID was very new for a lot of businesses, you know, and it took them time to figure out, and some businesses didn't have the right resources to help guide them and get them set up properly from an IT perspective, you know, and didn't have the right policies and procedures in place as a framework for what employees should or should not be doing in this new environment. So, I mean, COVID has left us all vulnerable, and for cyber criminals, that's really what they thrive off of, and what makes them successful. So the last piece that we're going to talk about today regarding the new environment is an increase in compliance requirements. You know, so whether these are written in your contracts you have with your supply chain partners, or they're federal or state requirements that you have to meet, or maybe they're related to a certification you have, whether it's CMMC or NIST CSF or IATF. You know, almost all of these compliance requirements have regulations related to IT security standards, and for a lot of manufacturers, it's a really big deal to be able to meet these requirements. Sometimes it determines whether or not, you know, they can do business. So it's essential that manufacturers that must comply to these, you know, understand how the remote work environment plays a factor in those compliance requirements. Go ahead, next slide, Jen. Okay, so let's look at some data quickly, just to give you all an idea of, you know, some of the current statistics are on the current climate of cybercrime. So the first one, as per the research conducted by Cybersecurity Ventures, within months of the first lockdown due to the COVID pandemic, more than 4,000 malicious COVID-related sites popped up across the internet. So these are harmful sites that hackers set up to deceive users, with the intent of downloading malicious software on their computer or manipulating them to give up sensitive information. I think this stat is interesting and quite relevant because it gives us some insight into how quickly hackers jumped on the opportunity to exploit people using COVID. Using literally what made most Americans vulnerable, taking advantage of people's fear. Cyber criminals at the end of the day are criminals. They manipulate and they take advantage and do whatever they can to be successful. So the next one, a cyber attack incident will occur every 11 seconds in 2021. I mentioned that earlier in the presentation. This is actually nearly twice the rate that it was in 2019. So every 19 seconds, a cyber attack occurred. And it's 4 times what it was in 2016, where it happened every 40 seconds. So this really puts into perspective, the true rise in cybercrime. And based on this stat, if you were at risk of experiencing a cyber attack in 2019, now the likelihood of you experiencing a cyber attack, has doubled in 2021. And then 91% of cyber attacks are launched through spear phishing emails. So this is a good one because it shows us how important of a role the users or the employees play in the security of a business. So for those of you who don't know, a spear phishing email is an email that is targeted specifically to the organization and to the person they are sending it to. Usually they either have a malicious link in the email that will download harmful software onto your computer, or if you click on it, or it will take you to a bad site. Either way, the success of these attacks depends on the actions of the user or the employee. So, if the employee is not trained to look out for these types of attacks and isn't knowledgeable on what they look like and how to spot them, the chances of them falling for an attack and clicking on something is much greater. And, it could be the difference between nothing happening and a very serious security incident occurring. And then according to the Verizon Business 2020 Data Breach Investigation Report, 28% of confirmed data breaches that were looked at in this study were small to mid-sized businesses. And this is just a percentage of incidences that were reported. So really, unless a business has a legal obligation to disclose a cyber attack, a lot of these attacks go unreported, which means there's a lot more attacks happening to small and mid-sized businesses than we're seeing on the news or in reports. And then the last one, 40% of small and mid-sized businesses experience 8 or more hours of downtime due to a cyber breach. So this one is helpful in that it really makes you think about how long can you afford to be down? As a business, what would the impact be of being down for 8 hours or more? That downtime causes a lot more than just financial loss, which we will cover in a little bit. So go ahead to the next slide. Jim. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so let's look at a few examples of some cyber breaches that are specifically related to the supply chain and some local manufacturers. So in 2020, the FBI actually sent out a cybersecurity alert to the US private sector, warning of an ongoing hacking campaign against supply chain software providers. So according to the FBI, hackers were attempting to infect upstream companies, particularly those in the energy sector. So this actually led to a data security incident with a company called SolarWinds that resulted in 18,000 people across the supply chain being infected with malware. And then also 40 companies on top of that were notified by Microsoft that they could potentially be impacted by this incident. So it really just shows you how widespread the effect of a cybersecurity incident can be, especially when the target is connected to the supply chain. And then I'm sure some of you have heard the news back in 2013 about Target getting hacked. And I know it's not the most current example, but I bring it up because of the way Target was hacked. So they were hacked because one of their third-party vendors, which was actually a small HVAC vendor, that had access to their systems. So that HVAC system or vendor was compromised, and the hackers were able to get into target system that way. So, you know, it shows you that there's so many ways a business can be vulnerable. Even a big company like Target, you know, with a ton of resources that they throw to their IT, you know, in a big, substantial IT security system. And then I want to share with you guys a couple examples of local manufacturers that experienced incidences like this, you know, and not really to scare you necessarily, but just to really press the point that this kind of stuff is happening in our community, you know, and to our neighbors, and it's a real threat. You know, so the first example, we know of a local Grand Rapids manufacturer that lost $500,000 because their supply chain vendor got hacked and started monitoring their emails. So the manufacturer ordered a product from the supply chain vendor. The hacker intercepted that email and then started corresponding directly to the manufacturer as if they were the vendor. The hacker gave the manufacturer their account info for a transfer of funds for an order that the manufacturer put in. And then the manufacturer sent the money directly to the hacker. So the manufacturer ended up calling the supply chain vendor directly with a question about the order. And that's when they realized the vendor knew nothing about the order. The money was gone, you know, and in the midst of all this as well, the hacker was also able to install malware on the manufacturer's network. So a devastating incident. You know, more recently, a local competitor of one of our manufacturing clients was hacked and was down for 2 weeks. You know, could not ship product for 2 weeks. I mean, really was paralyzed. And so that's, I mean, I can't even imagine being down for 2 weeks. You know, and then I'm sure you guys have heard of, you know, the incident with Steelcase in October of last year. Obviously, Steelcase is a huge company, but again, it just shows you that cyber criminals are active in our community, you know, and are targeting businesses that are neighbors. Go ahead, Jen, next slide. Okay, so, you know, some common things that we hear from local manufacturers on a regular basis is, okay, Ben, really, what is the likelihood that I will get hacked? Or, you know, why would anybody care about my data? I'm a smaller 20, 30 person shop. You know, don't they have bigger fish to fry? And I think what every business needs to think about instead and ask themselves is, do you care about your data? You know, what is your data worth to you? Hackers care about your data because you care about your data. You know, that's why they're successful, because when a business's data is taken from them, they are willing to pay the ransom to get it back. You know, if your data gets taken away from you, so let's say you show up to work, your entire system is down, you can't access any of your files, they're all encrypted, you know, you can't send invoices, you don't have any client info. Again, you're basically paralyzed from normal operations. Think about all the impacts it's going to have on your business. You know, never mind the financial impact. That one is obvious. It's the indirect impacts on your business that are just as severe. Think about, you know, downtime. How long can your business be down for before, you know, some very real implications start to arise? The average downtime, again, for a small to medium-sized business is 8 hours or more. That's a full day of not being able to do anything. You know, what will that downtime do? Think about it like to your reputation and your relationship with your partners in the supply chain. If you're down, it's going to be really hard to fulfill orders, keep the supply chain moving, you know, and if you have other businesses relying on your product, that's going to affect them as well. And then think about the time investment it takes to deal with everything, get lawyers on the phone, work with your IT company, you know, and insurance companies. At the end of the day, you know, it's really about how much risk you're willing to take on, with the understanding that there's a lot more at stake than just money. So when we talk about how important it is to really understand the security aspect of the remote work environment, you know, this is why. As a business owner, the last thing you want is to experience a cybersecurity breach, and having a handle on the remote work environment, you know, will help protect you from that. So, all right, next slide, Jen. All right, Julie, you're up.
All right, so Ben talked about the cybercrime, and now we're going to really focus on some remote worker tips. And I think it all starts with policies and procedures. And I think everybody from the business owner to the C-suite to shareholders to the receptionist to everybody on the floor has to participate in helping to secure the environment. And it really starts with putting those policies and procedures down as to, what is your IT security plan? Not just picking solutions off the shelf because you've heard that you need to do that, but to actually document and to train your people and to make sure everybody is accountable for those things. So one example that you would want to include in your security policy is, are your people using work-related equipment or are they using home-related equipment? If it's work-related equipment, I'm assuming that you're already managing your devices, that you've got endpoint protection, and you're doing a lot of the security things that businesses should be doing. When you take those devices home, typically you can still keep them pretty secure. But when people are using their personal devices, it's time to really put a lot of standards in place. And we'll talk about those more shortly. Another thing that's really important in your security plan is having a password strategy and policies. So, it could be, I overheard somebody the other day say, well, I can just let my daughter sign into my machine. I'm saying, no. Never let your family share your password or get into your work-related equipment. You never want to use the same passwords for different sites. You want to have long and complex passwords. And a lot of people say, well, I can't remember all those. And what we recommend is, as a company, you provide a password manager that you can control to all your people. There's a lot of great programs out there. What that means is they just have to know one user ID and password to get into that. And then the password manager will actually populate those user IDs and passwords into, say, a web browser to log on to certain portals. It just, you can create very complex passwords. You don't have to remember them. And if a user ID and password gets out on the dark web, it's not the password that's used for every application that you get into. And kind of tagging along with that, a really key thing is to implement multi-factor authentication. And what that means is you not only have a user ID and password, but you have a code that gets generated that you also have to enter. A lot of times we use smartphones for that. And what we hear from companies is they don't always provide smartphones for every one of their employees. And so what do you do when people don't necessarily want to use their personal devices? What we recommend is you put policies in place that, that you talk to employees about so that they are willing to use their personal devices to receive those codes. If that's not something that can be done, then there are like little password dongles and other solutions for that. But starting especially with email, because that's probably one of the most or easiest programs it seems to hack, or for hackers to get into, starting there is a great place. But I would also look at every one of your applications. Most of them will allow multi-factor authentication. Most portals allow that. And I would make sure I turn that on everywhere possible. And even moving into like a single sign-on where you have a utility that you can sign on to all your programs through that is a great way to protect your data. And then at the office, typically you're going to have your firewall. End users at home typically don't have firewalls. They might have their cable modem. And so I think it's a great idea if people can invest in that. If they can't, and you have like workers in finance where that information is really confidential, you might want to think about putting in a teleworker gateway appliance that will give them a secure tunnel back to the office. If nothing else, turning on, making sure the Windows firewalls are turned on. Those are just a click of a button application within Windows itself. One of the other things that we notice is sometimes people will name their router with their last name. And that's just broadcasting to the world that, hey, the Smiths have a wireless router. Now we know that belongs to them. If we want to try to, as a hacker, do more damage, that gives us the first clue of where to start. So highly recommend that those called SSIDs get changed to something that's very not relating to who you are. Businesses should also have virtual private networks in place for the remote workers. Typically, that could be a function of the firewall, but there's a lot of other solutions and ways to do that. A lot of times remote workers might think it's great to go to the coffee shop to work, and while that's convenient, it might be quieter than at home. You want to make sure that you're using what we call a VPN, virtual private network, because there could be people in that coffee shop that are watching everything that's going on the network. They could potentially see passwords, user IDs and passwords that are going across. So it's very important that either you have a cell phone with, say, a hotspot on it or a VPN before you do anything that's critical. And then end user security and awareness training. One of the #1 things that you should have a policy on and should implement to make sure that, as Ben mentioned before about phishing schemes, to keep employees aware of how legitimate those emails can actually look, but be very nefarious. And the whole spear phishing, where they're actually analyzing who works at the company. If I could call somebody up and say, hey, this is so-and-so from IT, I just talked to John over there and he mentioned this. They're trying to develop a relationship by knowing certain things about your company so that they can gain your trust and then hack in. And it's been, there's been studies that show that if you don't continuously train, if you do it once, 6 months later, basically people tend to forget about it. So something you need to keep in front and foremost. It's so easy, especially when you've got distractions at home. You see something of interest, it looks work related, you just click on it because you're not thinking. And it's far better to not click on links, but to look at those links, to manually go out to the site that they're actually looking for you to click on, to make sure and verify that it's actually legitimate. And if you get an email from you know, the president of the company asking you to do something, pick up the call and ask, verify that he's really asking you to send W-2s to him or to buy a bunch of gift cards. Just always question things like that that are coming through email when it's so easy to just pick up the phone and verify and ask. Okay, Jen. So good IT habits for remote workers. We want to make sure that you keep separate family and work computers. Ideally, employers, we supply the work computers, but if not, it's best to keep one for the family and one for work, and don't share your user IDs and passwords. Making sure you've got the latest operating system, making sure that you are updating the firmware on your devices, making sure that you're patching and updating, not just the operating system. With Windows, you can turn on automatic updates if your company isn't managing that for you. If it's your home machine, make sure you turn those on. Make sure you're updating your browsers and all of your common applications, things like Adobe Reader and JavaScript and your file sharing programs. All of those have updates, and you want to make sure that you patch them so that, you know, with software, there's always vulnerabilities. The developers, you do their best with millions of lines of code, and but there's constantly holes that hackers are finding. And companies like Microsoft and other application companies are constantly updating, but you have to make sure that you're not turning that off, that you are allowing that to happen. There's DNS security. What that does is, you know, when you type in microvisionsinc.com, it translates that to a numeric address. If you have a DNS, and that's domain name service, if you have an application that you purchase, such as OpenDNS, that will make sure that you don't go to a lot of bad sites. It will usually give you a warning if there's a site that you shouldn't be going to, that they know is nefarious, that's going to try to install malware and things like that. And it also usually allows some nice content filtering. So at home, if you don't want your kids going to certain sites, it'll provide some protection there. Because a lot of these bad sites, you know, they're trying to download malware and things to your PC. And so you want to protect against that. Absolutely, we need endpoint protection, antivirus, anti-malware software. Talked about the end user security awareness testing and training, keeping that top of mind. And then if you have devices like laptops that you're taking different places, making sure that the hard drive is encrypted. That way, if it does get stolen, they can't see the data that's on the machine. And then cyber insurance. It's a must. Very important to have cyber insurance. And then when you fill out those applications, you also want to make sure that you are, and this is, you know, referring more to businesses rather than the home user. You want to make sure that you're accurately answering all those questions. If you don't answer them accurately and you have a claim, the insurance company may deny that claim because you said you were doing, you know, encryption, but they found out you really weren't. Or you said you had endpoint protection on all your devices, and there were one or two that didn't, and those are the ones that got hacked. So very important to make sure you're doing your due diligence on that. Go ahead, Jen. And then the last thing that we want to talk about the new environment that Ben alluded to is the increasing compliance requirements. So what is compliance? I mean, it's anything that somebody requires you to do. If you're in the medical industry or you're working for people in the medical industry, there's HIPAA compliance, which is a federal law. If you take credit cards online, there's PCI compliance. That's an industry standard. What we're seeing a lot of is in contracts that you're signing with your clients or customers. A lot of times they're putting in very specific security measures that you need to take. And if something should happen and you didn't take those measures to do your due diligence, you could lose those contracts, you could be fined, you could be sued. We're even seeing that in some certifications, such as the International Automotive Task Force, that they are starting, well, they started maybe a year ago, to require various cybersecurity measures being put in there in order to maintain those certifications. For manufacturers, if you're doing any work with the Department of Defense, you've got the CMMC compliance requirements. Those are getting very stringent. It used to be, you know, you could self-audit, but for CMMC, by 2025, you will actually have to be audited. So we're seeing a lot more state requirements coming into play. Michigan just passed the DIFS law not too long ago. which focuses on insurance providers and financial industry. The New York Shield law, California has various regulations. So between the federal, the state, the industries, contracts, certifications, compliance is becoming a very important framework to follow. So I think that's all I have to cover today. Do we have any questions, John?
I'll unmute myself now. Yeah, actually, we do have some questions for Julie and Ben, and you can both take the question if it's in your area of specialty. So I'm going to start first regarding questions about the certifications and compliance. Will you share a little bit more about the compliance component for the certification? What certifications are out there? I know you mentioned the CMMC for Department of Defense. Are there other certifications if a manufacturer's not working in the scope of government contracting? Are there other certifications that kind of is like that seal of approval that they have the proper security systems in place?
Yeah, so one of them that I think would be a great one to follow, it's not a certification per se, but it's a framework. And what the framework does is basically, if you follow it, you're doing all the right things to secure your environment. So one of them, one part of that is making sure you have that cybersecurity or IT security policies and procedures to make sure you've got incident plans. If you have an incident, what are the steps you take depending on the type of incident you have, a disaster recovery planning. So it's it can be very intimidating. It's something we can definitely help with. But I would say the NIST CSF is a good framework to start following. And it will give you maybe, I don't know if I want to say force, but it will give you the things that you need to be doing. In terms of certifications, I mean, we mentioned the International Automotive Task Force. That's a voluntary certification, and they are just requiring, there were 3 sections that actually talk about cybersecurity. So if that's a certification that you want to have, then there are certain things you're going to have to do specifically for them in regard to cybersecurity. If you're doing something like NIST CSF, you probably have that covered.
So thinking about, so we've been talking a lot about manufacturing inside, internal operations and mitigating risks of cyber attacks. What approaches have you seen, thinking of supply chain, what approaches have you seen from a manufacturer's perspective on what their requirements are for security for the suppliers coming into them? Because it's a connection, it's a connection of technology, of information. So from a manufacturer's perspective, what should they be maybe putting in contracts with their suppliers to ensure that that pathway, doesn't, that a cyber attack doesn't come in through one of their suppliers?
Sure. Well, I think there's 5 to 10 key things that I would require of somebody. Mm-hmm. And things like, do you have a business class firewall with advanced security settings? Do you have endpoint protection? Are you patching? Are you training your users on phishing and other attacks? And I could list a bunch more, but I would, make sure that my suppliers are all following those things. And I also would look at, for us, we don't allow people to remote into our systems without our permission and our monitoring. And so you want to make sure you understand, what is it that they're getting into, if that's the case. And are they doing all their due diligence, and are they following any compliance standards? So it kind of depends on the situation as to how strong you want to be. But as I mentioned, we're seeing, even in some of the contracts that we have to sign with our clients, they're putting in very specific security things that they're expecting us to conform to.
Thinking about contracts, with the contracts, is it identified a subcategory of security, or where in those contracts for manufacturers should they be looking for the security requirements in the contracts? Have you seen patterns? Is it labeled, cybersecurity? Is it incorporated into a different type of subheading?
I would say, I'm trying to think of the ones that I've seen. You want to carefully read through your contracts. It will talk about cybersecurity, so you'll see the words in there typically. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that I could say overall, here's the spot you need to work, because every contract is unique. But I would definitely not just sign without diligently reading through and understanding what the expectations are. And you could also ask,
right,
do you have certain cybersecurity requirements in the contract? And they could point that out.
Better to know on the front end to make sure that you're complying.
Right.
Yep.
And then will you share a little bit more about the virtual private network, the VPN? Just when I was listening to you, Julie, I was thinking, with my work with the Manufacturing Growth Alliance, having the VPN, or just connecting with, one of my home wireless networks. So could you share a little bit more? I think maybe most of us know about VPN, but if we're not leveraging it, because we have now a work at home environment for many of our team members, what's the steps to even start thinking about what's the best VPN pathway for us?
Yeah, well, it should be really your IT department or your outsourced IT department that are helping you with that, because you're connecting to the network. They're going to determine probably what the best tool is to do that. As I mentioned before, a lot of times it goes hand in hand with the firewall. You can get add-on VPN licenses for those purposes, and they will know best how to implement that. From a home user perspective, there's a lot of programs out there. I'm testing out right now ExpressVPN. It does, a few things. It protects that, and also doesn't allow, like, our browsers to know everywhere we're going. Companies like Google are collecting a lot of information about us. They like to use that to advertise to us. That's not necessarily a bad thing. But from a privacy perspective, do I want somebody tracking everywhere I'm going and everything I'm doing? As a company, do I want them potentially seeing things that I'm doing? Not really. So when I go to the coffee shop, I've got that VPN in place to protect and secure where I'm going and what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of two parts to it. It's, from the business perspective, I want to protect the business information of my employees. I'm mainly concerned about what they're doing work related. And then there's the perspective of my company may not be giving me advice and guidance on that, but I want to do some due diligence because I want to go to the coffee shop or whatever. So you could invest in one that's not that expensive. Okay. But they're kind of, two different functions in a sense too. So It's good to talk to your IT people, or if you want to have a conversation with us, we'd be happy to, give you some free advice on that.
And something like that would be included in your policies and procedures, because at least my experience, sometimes VPNs, and I'm sure there's a lot out there, a number of them to access. Sometimes it's a little clunky to use a VPN, but having that in your policies and procedures that offsite employees must use VPN, that would go into your policies and procedures.
Yeah, and they have to be policies and procedures that don't just sit on the shelf, but you're actively reviewing them on a regular basis, that you're training your people on them, that you're really making sure that your expectations are laid out and clear. And your reason for doing them is to make sure that you understand what needs to be done and that you're thinking about it as the business owner. A lot of times business owners say, my IT people take care of that. But ultimately, if the business gets sued, it's going to come down to the owner or the shareholders. So very important to take those seriously and outline that for your company.
So just two more questions for you. Something that you just said, Julie, reminded me of asking the question, how often should a small to medium-sized business assess their technology infrastructure to look at your cyber criminals are out there, and they're always creative and innovative. Programs are always evolving. How often is it? Twice a year that an IT department or business owner needs to pause and say, okay, we need to take a fresh look at what equipment maybe we've brought into our facility, team members that have been brought in, what's new out there from a hacker perspective, but also from a mitigating risk perspective. Is that 6 months? Is that quarterly, annually? Could you share a little bit about how often a tech assessment is needed?
Sure. Yeah, well, we would call it a IT risk assessment, and we would start there. So start to see what your baseline is. And then, ideally you're doing that every year. But if you start with an IT risk assessment and then you can put together a plan. You can't do everything probably at once. At least we've found that most of the small businesses that we work with, it's more of a growth perspective, meaning we start with the low-hanging fruit. What do we need to do first, second, third, kind of have that roadmap. And you always have to consider there's not just an unlimited amount of money that we can throw at every solution out there. So what are the best things to do to give us the most bang for the buck that will give us a return on investment? A lot of the things that we do, we're actually doing scans on a monthly basis. Okay. We're reviewing things with our clients on a quarterly basis. So because the network is kind of a living, breathing thing, things are always changing, updates, new things, new equipment. So having kind of an ongoing assessment will help catch a lot of those things. And hopefully your IT provider is talking to you about security and the things that are happening. And, for example, there was a zero-day exploit with Exchange recently, Microsoft Exchange on-premise. So hopefully, you were alerted by your IT company if you had that particular program on site. And you're doing something about it. Now that's sort of an after the fact. What can we be doing to be proactive? But that should be something that you're working with your internal IT department or your external IT department on a regular, ongoing basis.
And then for right now, I think we just have one more question, and that is focused on new technologies being brought into a manufacturing facility. Michigan recently launched an Industry 4.0 initiative where the state recognizes that our small to medium manufacturers have to evolve and adopt these 4.0 technologies, which are very broad and expansive, but they all have technology associated with them, whether you're analyzing data and capturing and analyzing data in a new way, or you're looking at bringing in advanced technologies to support your facility. Have you seen an increase in the manufacturers that you work with? One, adopting new technologies, and two, running parallel to that IT, that assessment, because as manufacturers evolve in Industry 4.0 technologies, right alongside that, at least from my perspective and listening to you, Julie and Ben, running right alongside that needs to be a close relationship with IT department or their outsourced IT department. So could you just talk a little bit about how those two, the IT infrastructure and the mitigating cyber risk, and then advancing technologies, and how they, at least from my lens, maybe I'm wrong, but how they run parallel to each other?
Well, first of all, don't bring IT in after you've already decided on the solution. I think they need a seat at the table, even when you're thinking about bringing in a new technology, new solutions. Bring them in at the start so they can ask good questions, that they can look for how to secure it, and the impact that it's going to have. So, with the industrial Internet of Things, there's different ways we want to secure the network to make sure that things that might happen in one area don't overflow into the next area. So I think it's just important to have your IT people there at the start rather than at the tail end, because that's what happens a lot of times. And then it's very difficult to make sure that the right solution has been selected. So I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Absolutely. It does run parallel, and you need to bring IT in first and foremost when the conversations start.
Yep.
So that they can run parallel.
Exactly.
Right.
The technologies that are being brought in.
Yep.
Excellent. Well, it is, we have a few minutes left, but I don't see any additional questions. So I'm gonna just thank you, Julie and Ben, for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. I thought the presentation was spot on for what we've been hearing from manufacturers. So hopefully it was helpful to those joining today. And I will get the recording out to those that registered. I'll do that within 24 hours. In that communication, you'll also have contact information for Microvision, so you can reach out to, do you want them to reach out to you, Julie, or you, Ben, or does it matter?
Have them reach out to Ben, and
Okay.
then he'll coordinate whatever meetings or conversations that need to happen.
Fantastic. So I
And
will,
just want to say we'd be happy to have some conversations with people. We'd love to educate, and call us if you'd like to talk.
well, thank you again, Julie and Ben. It's been very informative, and I'll circle back to all those registered within 24 hours.
Sounds
Thanks
good.
for
Thanks,
having
Jen.
us.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.